Dr. King, if I may, I found this in this morning's paper. Negroes hail results of Dr. King's policy. Berkeley, California, more than 4 out of 5 American Negroes believe the nonviolence of Dr. Martin Luther King has done the most to help their race, the study reveals. But about half of the same Negroes interviewed for a University of California study believe riots have done some good. Findings, which include interviews with 1,119 Negroes, were released in a book titled Protest and Prejudice. Author Gary T. Marks, now assistant sociology professor at Harvard University, reports the majority of Negroes seem to direct their hatred and anger toward the system of evil and those who support it, not indiscriminately against all whites. Can you comment on that article?
Yes, I'm very interested in hearing that. I hadn't read the article, and I hadn't read the book. In fact, I wasn't aware of it. But I think it is true that the vast majority of Negroes feel that the best way to resolve the problem is to work through peaceful, nonviolent means and militant nonviolence, but not through violence. Now, on the question of whether riots have helped, I've taken the position that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating, and therefore I have to take a stand against it because of my deep commitment to nonviolence. On the other hand, I do think a riot is the language of the unheard, and America has failed to hear, for instance, that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last 10 or 15 years. I think it has also failed to hear that large segments of white society are more committed to tranquility and the status quo than to justice and humanity and equality. And in that sense, I think the riots have called attention to something. Not that they have brought about social transformation, but they've called attention to a very serious problem in our society. But I couldn't say that they have been helpful in the sense of really bringing about structural change. I haven't seen any basic change that has come through riots. The changes that we have made and the changes that we've seen over the last 10 or 12 years have come through powerful, watershed, nonviolent movements.
Well, have the militant leaders taken over the civil rights movement, in your opinion?
Well, there again, I think a poll like this reveals that most Negroes are still following the leadership of those who feel that the problem must be worked out through nonviolence. After all, riots have been engaged in by a very small number of Negroes when you think of the fact that there are some 22 million Negroes in the United States. Now, when you use the word militant, I think it is possible to be militant and yet nonviolent. I think I'm militant. Militancy means persistent, to be demanding, to be insistent. And I think it's possible to be militantly nonviolent. And these, I think, are going to be the leaders who will lead us through this very tense period of transition.
Doctor, what do you think of the approach of this Soapy Carmichael and the H. Rap Brown?
Well, naturally, there are philosophical disagreements I have with both Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Brown. But I always have to say...
Did you discuss these disagreements with them?
Oh, very definitely. I know them very well.
Do they agree with you?
We work together in the movement a good deal, and I'm sure they would disagree with me on a number of things.
In other words, they're not too friendly with you sometimes.
Well, that's quite right. But in answering the question about them, I always go beyond them because I think they are products of the problem rather than causes of the problem. And I always have to think of the fact that it's very easy to take our visions from the causal basis, from the root of the problem, and see the consequence out here and begin to major on that. Neither Rap Brown nor Stokely Carmichael created slavery. They did not create slums. They did not create unemployment or underemployment. They did not create segregated or qualityless schools. And they didn't start a war in Vietnam. These things were started by other forces in our society. It was Victor Hugo who said once, where there is darkness, crimes will be committed. The guilty one is not merely he who commits a crime, but he who caused the darkness. And I think we have to admit that these men didn't cause the darkness. They are the products of the darkness, and this is their bitterness.
How about their following? Do they have a growing or important following among American Negroes?
Well, I would say among the young population, there are those who are listening more to Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Brown. I wouldn't say that they have a large following. I still think it's a minority. But if conditions do not change, if they are not made better, and if programs do not emerge that really go all out to get rid of the deprivation surrounding the life of the Negro, then they will probably have a greater appeal.
What will this do to the power of Dr. Martin Luther King at that point?
Well, I never like to discuss Martin Luther King's influence for fear that is suggestive of your modesty. I'm just trying to do a job, and I think it's a job that has to be done, and I'm not trying to do it merely for myself, or merely for my children, or merely for the Negro, but for America, because I think it's true that if this problem isn't solved, the soul of our nation will be lost, and the only way to redeem the soul of America is to remove or to eradicate racism in all of its dimensions.
Dr. King, in the past you've been accused of having communist sympathies, and since your stand has to help the communist cause, aren't you concerned that these allegations will be revived?
Well, they are always revived. I hate that McCarthy eras tend to live with us, but I don't really worry about this. I know my own views too well.
Are you a communist
Absolutely
sympathizer?
not. I have never been. I am not now, and I never will be in terms of the philosophy of communism. I happen to be a Baptist preacher, and I don't think you find too many Baptist preachers who would be communists. I think communism is based on a metaphysical materialism and a kind of ethical relativism and a crippling totalitarianism and a denial of certain human freedoms that I consider basic, First Amendment freedoms that I consider so basic that I could never be a communist or prefer the communist way of life. But I do feel that we've got to recognize the fact that communism is in the world, and we're going to either have to have peaceful coexistence or violent co-annihilation.
Dr. King, we have certainly appreciated your stopping by today. We have enjoyed this visit very much, and thank you so much.
Enjoy meeting you.
Martin Luther King, we'll be right back.